So before we get into the CRA second position, just a background on the AFP for everyone, in case this isn't sort of familiar to you. We've dug up some language that's been used in some of the template agreements to provide an insight into sort of what the AFP was set up originally for. And on a high level, it's really there to provide funding to help recognize the unique contributions of academic physicians. And this is divided into their clinical services and then also their academic activities. And hopefully they can do that in a more of an integrated manner with this alternative funding provided to them. So this is, again, also to improve the coordination and integration between the medical staff, teaching hospitals, and universities. So it's sort of a one-stop funding. It also has some benefits in terms of recruitment and retention of these doctors. So recognition that it is difficult to always have competition with academic faculty that could be doing pure clinical services.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but if you can speak louder, please.
Yep. Just going to make sure my mic volume keeps dropping on the app here. Is that better? Okay. And also, it's to make sure that the funding that the physicians receive is done so in an open and transparent manner. There used to be a number of funding sources, a number of funding mechanisms that they would have that maybe wasn't as clear and difficult to get a hold of. So AFP came along and sort of helped bundle that all up. There's some very specific definitions, I guess, that are mentioned in the back pages, in the appendices of these documents. They define what academic activities means. It's been broken up into teaching and research. Also, there's administrative activities that are mentioned. There's also this critical Ontario participation that's required, and they're also required to make sure that all your on-call coverage is maintained through those 24-hour services. On the service side, clinical services typically means the stuff that you bill for in OHIP, but there's sort of the outreach services, the insured services, which are the OHIP, and then any sort of indirect services. So it's a pretty broad definition of what they need to be doing. Also, we wanted to mention some of the categories that you'd find in terms of the funding that's delivered to individual MPCs. So when you see any sort of funding summaries, they're going to be under categories specifically for administration, additional clinical phase 1. Okay. Anyways, is that let's try to get through some of these definitions that we'd find in the back of these AFP agreements. So doctors, they're describing some of the services on just a high level. So they've got activities, meaning teaching and research, sort of broadly defined. They've also have academic, administrative activities that would be to do. They also have to participate in this Critical Ontario, which is a service to make sure that around-the-clock coverage in terms of the services that they are providing are there. So that covers a lot of their day-to-day OHIP billings. On the services side, clinical services can also mean the insured services, which would be sort of OHIP, and indirect services or any other clinical services provided. So even in the AFP agreement, it's a very broad definition of the types of activities and services that they're obligated to provide, not just narrowly the teaching and any other research. And when we see the funding categories, actually, when we get a sort of breakdown of the funding, they are in a wide variety of categories, including administrative, additional clinical phase 1. There's some adjustments, and then there's also recruitment fees actually broken out when we do see these funding mechanisms. The main delivery mechanism for AFP you'll see it comes into the hospitals as a sort of a global fund, and then these funds are allocated and distributed to the different practice plans, so department level or to the individual doctors by the administration group. This is really done on a full-time equivalent basis. There's not much administrative oversight in terms of what the doctors are doing. It's just, did you provide a full-time equivalent of services, and then their AFP is delivered through to them. And right now, the only linkage that is possibly done here is via their appointment letters from the universities. So, they may have a loose percentage allocation of how they should be spending their clinical time or their teaching or their activities based on some pretty loose percentages. So the second position that we wanted to describe today was CRA's position with respect to this AFP funding. And this is taken right out of a report that was received by one of our clients. And essentially they're considering pretty much all of the AFP as funding. They've broken out some of the categories that they feel could be allocated for shred basis. And that would include those base clinical fund repairs, their academic funding, and any sort of enrichment funding. So this was taken directly from a report and was, again, this position was reiterated by someone called the Coordinator of Medical Files. We know that in Toronto that might be Smita Shah, but we're not sure if that's just office by office or whether that's a national position. So our analysis of that is that there is really no direct link from AFP funds to sort of any sort of direct shred work being completed. Certainly there's a range of activities and services that AFP funds are for, but shred is a very special subset of research, and really what AFP was intended for is probably not lining up directly with the shred activities. The AFP is much more broader than the definition of shred by any means. So we also have some information here about how when this AFP agreement was put together on a high level originally, there was a bit of a thought process in terms of how this funding should be allocated or possibly arrived at. They had looked at sort of the split between doctors spending their time in clinical and academic type activities and had in their mind this sort of 70-30 split. Clinical being sort of the billable time, academic being a combination of all other activities essentially, including the rounds they're teaching, any conferences they go to, papers being written, etc. And then also a rough estimate of sort of a 2/3 split of this 30% went to teaching and 1/3 possibly to R&D. So that gives us a sort of a total of 10% of their time roughly was estimated for R&D activities at the outset of this AFP funding program. And we've seen this sort of language reflected in any academic appointment letter that's a bit boilerplate. So this 70-20-10 split. We've also noticed that these academic appointment letters are only given once, really, and really no updates are provided to them. It's not like every year these appointment letters are revisited or are updated in terms of percent to reflect what the doctors are actually doing. We're also finding that there is no real guidance or direction from the AFP body to the hospital or sort of oversight in terms of what research is being completed, or in probably the extreme case, if any research was being done by particular doctors or departments. So a doctor will receive their AFP funding as long as their full-time equivalent services are rendered, and there's really no oversight there. So that's another thing that we were considering. And what we've tried to present here is maybe 3 different options that you could look to present an argument back to CRA. And this would be three different ways that you could present, and we could go the extreme way and say, well, look, nothing in AFP should be considered a shred. There's nothing in there that dictates what type of research the doctors. You can't make a link between a very specific project that the doctor is undertaking and the requirement from any AFP thing. So you could file with basically no offset from the AFP funding onto your shred case. Number two here is something we've tried where really we made this link where AFP is allocated on a full-time equivalency basis. So we're almost treating it the same way as any sort of apprenticeship grant or any sort of grant that would be given to a salaried employee where it's just dependent on their participation over the year. So it's offsetting all of the hours spent by that individual. And in this way, so we would calculate the percentage of time spent on shred activities and then take the percentage of AFP funding that they were provided, multiplied by that shred percentage, and that's the amount of AFP that should be offset against the activities about the shred claim by that doctor or by that department. And so this acknowledges that perhaps some of it was linked or for the research, but in a very overall manner. Option 3 is really there to, as a possible solution or to solve both issues that we've seen from CRA. And this is where we really have to figure out what the doctors are doing on a yearly basis in all their categories, trying to figure out how their time is being spent fulfilling their clinical duties, fulfilling their teaching duties, fulfilling their other R&D activities. And then if they decide or are spending additional effort on shred-related activities that kind of go above and beyond their sort of base requirements, and we can make that argument, this is a very strong case to be made back to CRA so that the claim is very defendable. So this does require not full tracking of their time, but an understanding of where their on-call hours are, where their sort of hospital duties are being booked in, and then all the additional time that they're spending on R&D or other things, whether it's shred or not. So we also wanted to present another alternative solution that we've seen. This is the sort of formation or pooling of research funds and the creation of a eligible research institute. So this is an option in the shred rules where third-party payments can be made to an eligible research institution, and these the contributions are made from the individual doctors or sort of on a department level, and it would be a sort of a set amount goes into the research institute, and then it gets almost funneled back to whoever's performing the R&D within the department or across the whole hospital. So in this case, the MPCs would be essentially just claiming back this third-party payment. They're not making a full, project-by-project shred claim, but they're getting a credit on this contribution. And then the funding can be directed to whomever is doing the shred, whoever is doing the research in the department, and it's less on a sort of case-by-case basis. So, this is nice. I think there's a few cases of this working, but it hinges on that research institute following the rules, making sure that everything's there. Otherwise, it's a lynch point where a lot of doctors' claims could be voided after if that institute is sort of attacked by CRA. So again, we still see some possible issues here, and there would be obligations from the doctors put on by this research institute, and then how much of that is also part of their academic or hospital appointments or obligations. So and there's also again possibly the offset of AFP still being counted against this payment. So we're not quite out of the woods with a solution like this either. And so our sort of final point here, we have had some response, I guess, to these issues early this year. it's got to the point in appeals where these claims are piling up and they're just not sure what to do with them in general. So they've kind of, in a way, I guess, held up some of our claims there, waiting for guidance from appeals headquarters. They are sort of indicating to us that there is no real national full-on strategy to deal with this, and really there hasn't really been any sort of consultation with the medical community on this front. Our claimants are being stonewalled a little bit at this point, so things are being escalated around this by sending it to tax court and dealing with it there. So we're sort of advising our guys to escalate this as fast as possible, get it into the appeals process, wait the 90 days, and then proceed to tax court. Both groups of CRA are just at the office level and at the appeals level are just really not dealing with this in any
Thank you very much, Nick and Andrea.
Thanks.
We're going to go on to Maurice now, and then after Maurice and Russ, then there'll be an opportunity for questions. We're going to hold on till after we hear Russ speak, because Russ has time commitments. So we're going to move on now and hear Maurice talk about the same issue. Thank you.